I'm delighted to be back in the United States, my hunting ground of 35 years. The country where I had my innings in the social and economic struggle, and where I decided to devote myself to the presentation of anarchism, a social philosophy which aims at the emancipation, economic, social, political, and spiritual of the human race.
Greetings, citizens and victims of the Empire. This is the Authority Smashers Radical Report, your anarchist radio show / podcast on the internet, bringing you radical analysis of news, politics, commentary, and reports from the front lines of the struggle. You can join our page on Facebook and catch our stored shows at authoritysmashers.wordpress.com. Now, this show is brought to you by the letter A with a circle around it. Now remember, this is an interactive show. If you want to call in live to speak with us or just listen in, you can reach us at 917-932-8111. If you have a question or comment or news you want to talk about, you can call in during the headlines and we'll have you on after. Alright, today is December 10th, 2012. This is Derek from Tampa. And we're going to jump into some headlines from Democracy Now! And around the interwebs. I have some Wal-Mart updates. New details have been revealed on Wal-Mart's ties to the Bangladeshi garment factory, where 120 workers died in a fire last month. The New York Times is reporting Wal-Mart played a key role in blocking the improvement of electrical and fire safety at the Bangladeshi factories. Two officials who attended a 2011 meeting in Bangladesh say a Wal-Mart representative helped quash a proposal to improve safety investments, calling them, quote, not financially feasible. Documents found at the fire scene also show that 5 of the factory's 14 production lines were devoted to making Wal-Mart apparel. And in the beginning, Wal-Mart tried to distance themselves from this story and try to say, oh, this doesn't have anything to do with Wal-Mart or Wal-Mart's decision making. Well, now we know the truth. And meanwhile, in the United States, Wal-Mart is drawing criticism for reportedly planning to deny health insurance to newly hired employees working less than 30 hours a week, shifting the burden for their care onto the federal government. An internal company policy obtained by the Huffington Post shows newly employed part-time workers will no longer receive benefits, while those hired in or after 2011 will also lose out if their hours dip below 30 hours a week. Labor experts say Wal-Mart is following other large employers and exploiting Obamacare to shift high costs onto taxpayers. In its response to the story, Wal-Mart refused to disclose how many workers will lose their coverage by saying it's decided to no longer answer questions from the Huffington Post, which it accused of biased coverage. The new policy is slated to take effect next month. And it just further shows how Wal-Mart is subsidized, and their business is subsidized through corporate welfare and through subsidized on both ends of coming from taxpayers, in that taxpayers have to subsidize the workers of Wal-Mart who do not get any health insurance, adequate health insurance, and pensions and other things that they would need, or let alone supplying a living wage and keeping it under there. So people who work at Wal-Mart have to file for different types of federal assistance. They tend to sometimes have to file for food stamps and other kinds of Medicaid, and there's even internal documents that Walmart shares with new hires where they tell people how to get public assistance. And Walmart is always shown as this great triumph of the free market, but it really shows how much of the risk of business is socialized onto the taxpayers and to society as a whole. In an update on Hostess, in August 2011, the company just stopped contributing to its workers' pensions and is now acknowledging that it instead used the money for operational expenses. The money that didn't go into pension funds was money that the workers had bargained for and chosen to take as pension instead of wages. And that's always the key thing to remember with wages is that, and pensions, is that pensions are just a holdout or a future promise on future pay for work done in the present. And this is often used in lieu of higher or a living wage, and this has become part to the course for American businesses since at least the 70s of pushing pensions into 401ks and further into the stock market, and they're really now rating what pensions still exist. And of course, companies that either are not doing well financially try to use pensions as an excuse for high overhead and why they're in the red, and blame it on the workers asking for too much in pensions when they've actually earned that money already just by working. The political crisis in Egypt is deepening as critics of President Mohamed Morsi have continued to reject his bid for a referendum on a draft constitution passed by an Islamist-dominated panel. Now, last Tuesday, thousands of people took to the streets, and protests are continuing in Egypt following a speech by President Morsi aimed at quelling widespread anger over his assertion of wide-ranging powers and his ongoing push for a referendum on a new constitution. In a national address Thursday night, Morsi offered to sit down with the opposition following violent clashes that left 7 people dead and hundreds wounded. Despite offering to engage in dialogue, Morsi refused to cancel his plans for a referendum, saying Egyptian voters will decide the constitution's fate. Critics have opposed the referendum and say the proposed constitution was drafted without a proper representation of Egyptian society. In response, protesters flooded Cairo's Tahrir Square to call for Morsi's departure. Morsi's speech came hours after opponents attacked the offices of Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood Party and set its headquarters on fire. And there was also a surrounding of the parliament, and tanks were called out to move the protesters away from the parliament. Now, Morsi has given the army the power to arrest people and order them to protect state institutions ahead of the vote set for December 15th. At least 7 people have died in clashes, and hundreds of thousands have taken to the streets since Morsi granted himself these sweeping powers in that decree last month. Morsi attempted to appease the mounting turmoil Sunday by rescinding most of the decree's provisions. He was basically saying, I'm going to be a temporary dictator rather than a dictator for life. And but the move hasn't stopped his opponents from calling for a fresh round of mass protests starting Tuesday. The head of Egypt's lawyer syndicate spoke on behalf of the main opposition group Sunday, and we're having a very divided government, and we're seeing the one set of judges and these judges' panels resisting this move by Morsi and his group of lawmakers to try to push through this constitution that would ratify dictatorial powers for him, that would include basically not even being able to question him, and outlawing freedom of speech and expression in the media, and therefore no press would criticize Morsi. The usual dictator's bag of goodies. Now, protesters in Mahala, the largest industrial city in Egypt, threw out the head of their city council Friday night and announced their autonomy from the Muslim Brotherhood state. Quote, "We no longer belong to the Ikhwani state." They announced from the city council. Mahala is known for its clashes with the police in 2008, which some analysts consider to be the spark of the January 25, 2011 revolution. And that is great news, and it really shows the work of industrial unions in Egypt being the backbone and the foot soldiers of the revolution. And all of this, what's going on with Morsi, really shows why you don't have halfway revolutions. You know, demanding free elections within the framework of a liberal democracy does nothing but change the face of the ruling dictator. People voted for Morsi as a lesser of two evils, and Morsi is predictably claiming dictatorial powers. Now, the revolution needs to be continued, and liberal democracy should not be the end goal. Just look at South Africa to see what happens when revolutionaries leave neoliberal capitalism and the ruling class in place. And we're seeing more and more of that, and how the income inequality has grown, the black underclass has grown, more than 1 million people without flushing toilets and food and sewage and plumbing in South Africa, all because the so-called communist revolutionaries had a plan of propping up capitalism before they could get their socialism in order, and they ultimately just propped up the capitalism. And ultimately, when it comes to Egypt, the ruling class, whether it was the military judges council and Mubarak, this financial elite that runs that maintains the ruling class of Egypt, are the ones who have made the neoliberal changes to Egypt that have worsened their income inequality, making it one of the lowest in the world, probably only tied with the United States in comparison to the very richest of the rich and the poorest of the poor gap. Now, some great news from Greece. A little-known anti-fascist group said on December 8th that it was behind a bomb attack on an office of Greece's neo-Nazi Golden Dawn party this week that ripped through a wall and smashed windows but caused no injuries. The dynamite-packed device was planted outside a branch of the party whose popularity has surged during Greece's debt crisis. The Anti-Fascist Front said in an internet statement that it was responsible for the pre-dawn attack near Athens. It said it was affiliated with the Informal Anarchist Federation, FAI, a group which has claimed several attacks across Europe, mostly in Italy, where they kneecapped a vice president or somebody in charge of a nuclear power plant that was expanding in Italy against the will of the people. Now, basically, they have a quote here from them, quote, "We decided to hit Golden Dawn's office because we believe that you have to hit out fascists first before they hit you," end quote. The front said. The authenticity of its claim could not be immediately verified, and a Greek police source said the group was not known to the security forces. Whoop-de-doo. What do they know? And this is the police who are in direct cahoots with the neo-Nazis and make up a good portion of the party. We kind of have a trifecta of the Greek Orthodox Church, the Golden Dawn, and the police force trying to create a new dictatorship in Greece, modeled after the Nazis, which is so ironic given that the hardships and the resistance that the Greeks put up against Nazi occupation of Greece. In protest news, in Oslo, Norway, protesters carried carrying lit torches flooded the city streets Sunday night to condemn today's awarding the Nobel Peace Prize to the European Union. They criticized the European Union for demanding harsh austerity cuts in Greece and condemned its member states for exporting a major share of the world's weapons. The EU is receiving the award for its historic role in uniting the continent, but the selection has been controversial, with critics saying European arms sales and use of military force, including support for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, are in direct violation of Alfred Nobel's will. Now, of course, the Nobel Peace Prize, as an institution, the Nobel Commission, has always been an institution of the ruling classes and has reflected their winnings of these awards and these nominations of these awards to many deserving people who recognizing deserving fights and stuff. We always have to remember who Alfred Nobel was as an arms dealer, and the makeup of the committees. And I think that the emperor really has no clothes at this point, since nominating Barack Obama with the Nobel Peace Prize before he did anything, and letting him keep it after he has killed hundreds of thousands of people with his drone strikes. And of course, this is our failing institutions being rewarded by other failed institutions in this naked emperor fashion, while society crumbles around them in Europe, and people are fighting back against the austerity that the EU is pushing on them, and that the IMF is forcing through the technocratic dictatorships like in Greece and the other pig states. There's this new report that came out of the NYU School of Law and Stanford Law School that details how U.S. drones employ a tactic known as the double tap that is considered to be a terrorist act by the U.S. government. The double tap is when a targeted strike is hit multiple times by Hellfire missiles in a relatively quick succession, meaning that the second missile often strikes first responders, which of course is a war crime to attack first responders. And a 2007 report by Homeland Security Institute called the double tap, quote, a favorite tactic of Hamas, and the FBI considers it a tactic employed by terrorists. The new report, Living Under Drones, provides first-hand accounts of its devastating effect on rescuers and humanitarian workers. The report concludes that double taps by U.S. drones raises crucial moral and legal concerns. Not only does the practice put into question the extent to which secondary strikes comply with international humanitarian law's basic rules, but it also potentially violates specific legal protections for medical and humanitarian personnel and for the wounded. As international law experts have noted, intentional strikes on first responders may constitute war crimes. Now, the report cites Pentagon data to note that the Air Force may have began firing 2 missiles to covertly compensate for the lack of accuracy of their Hellfire missiles, meaning that the missiles are, quote, at most only 50% reliable, which is not how this system has been described to Congress. Now, of course, this is sickening, and it puts the hypocrisy of U.S. foreign policy on full display to have our forces doing what our government deems terrorism. But it's not terrorism when we do it. Now, also in some news from Afghanistan, the U.S. military has detained more than 200 teenagers at a prison near the Bagram airfield, accusing them of being, quote, enemy combatants. The U.S. report submitted to the United Nations says young people, most of them about 16, have been detained for average stays of a year in order to, quote, prevent a combatant from returning to the battlefield. And of course, that's always very convenient when there are no such persons of being enemy combatants to return to said battlefield. But some critics say the alleged combatants are as young as 11 or 12 years old. When the last report was submitted in 2008, just 10 young people were being held at the prison. Under the George W. Bush administration, thousands of young people were detained, almost all of them in Iraq. I also want to point out a senior Army officer suggested that troops were on the lookout for children with potential hostile intent. You heard that correctly, children with hostile intent. So it's not just hyperbole to call these people baby killers. And some of the footage and pictures that came out of Abu Ghraib, where we saw the sexualized torture of detainees, much of it includes women being raped and children being abused and sexually molested and raped. And this is all done under the aegis of our war on terror. Now, the United Nations Climate Change Summit wrapped up this weekend in Doha with no new commitments from the United States to reduce carbon emissions or provide aid to countries suffering the worst impacts of climate change. The final deal saw the extension of binding emissions cuts under the Kyoto Protocol for a second commitment period. But only a fraction of the world's greenhouse gas emissions are covered. Several countries, including Japan and Canada, have opted out of the protocol, which the United States never even ratified. Critics said the deal reached by nearly 200 countries was far too weak to avoid the deadly impacts of catastrophic climate change. And Alden Meyer of the Union of Concerned Scientists criticized the summit's outcome during a news conference, and I want to read this quote by Alden Meyer. He said, quote, "There were some winners here. The coal industry won here. The oil industry won here. The fossil fuel industry won here. You saw on display the power of these industries and their short-term profit motivation to dominate the governments of the world. This wasn't an environmental or a scientific-driven discussion. This was a trade fair. This was a who's going to share the spoils of the world as we drill the Arctic and produce tar sands in Canada and mine coal in Indonesia for China. This is not the future we need to leave to our children." And I don't think you could say it any better. And the institutions ruling over us had a chance to save the human species from extinction. And they failed, not for trying and failing, but for doing nothing and planning to profit from the chaos. And of course, the wealthiest countries are to blame, and the poorest are the ones that will suffer. Now, despite increasing scientific studies showing a rapidly warming planet and greenhouse gas emissions rising annually by 3%, that could bring the world up to a 5-degree Celsius increase by 2100, and growing extreme weather events, nothing will be done. It's up to the people of the world now to resist the killing of our species by capitalism. And a federal study in Domestic News has found the drilling practice known as fracking can trigger earthquakes, as we have long suspected. The U.S. Geological Survey found that oil and gas operations caused the majority, if not all, earthquakes in certain areas of New Mexico and Colorado between 2001 and 2011. The report's co-author, U.S. Geological Survey scientist Justin Rubinstein, called fracking a societal risk we need to be considering. And this is why the actions of those protesting the XL pipeline are important to our survival. And the activists like Matt Almonte from Tampa that were held up inside the pipe have been arrested, and you can write to them and help contribute to their legal fund. You can go to tarsandsblockade.org for more information and where to donate. Now, Republican lawmakers in Michigan have advanced a pair of anti-union bills aimed at making theirs the 24th so-called right-to-work state. in the country. On Thursday, the Michigan House narrowly approved a measure that would ban the mandatory payment of union dues in the private sector. The Michigan State Senate also passed a separate measure curbing union dues. State Republicans have sought to advance the anti-union legislation before Democrats gain 5 House seats in the new legislature beginning next month. Now, Thursday's vote was held over the raucous objections of union supporters who crowded the state capitol in protest. At least 8 demonstrators were arrested. After initially opposing the measures, Michigan Governor Rick Snyder now says he will sign them into law if given final approval, and more protests are expected next Tuesday when Republican supporters aim to finalize the bill. Now, big business-controlled conservative AstroTurf groups are reserving the Capitol steps and related areas to keep protesters away, and that really shows who's behind what here. And I wanted to get people's attention to this. Ross Eisenbray wrote a short piece called Workers Want Unions Now More Than Ever on the blog of the Economic Policy Institute. Now, to summarize, in 1984, about a third of non-union workers wanted a union to represent them, while 2/3 said they would definitely or probably vote against forming a union. By 2005, nearly the opposite was true. 53% of non-union workers wanted a union, and only a little more than a third said they would vote against a union. According to a new survey research by Richard Freeman of Harvard University that combines results from both union and non-union private sector workers, says, quote, if workers were provided the union representation they desired in 2005, then the unionization rate would be 58%, almost 8 times higher than the actual rate of 7.4%, and considerably higher than the 44% found in polls in the mid-1990s. Eisenbray concludes that Americans approve of unions and want unions to represent them. Only employer hostility and inadequate laws keep employees from having the union representation they want. And of course, I think that it's a great starting point for workers, and hopefully they, as rank and file workers, can influence the unions that they join to be more militant about fighting for what the workers want and not get diverted into the traps of business unionism that just protects the union bosses and bureaucracy at the expense of workers. Now, of course, it's the latter that has soured workers on unions and gives unions a bad name to non-members. Now, I want to get into some radical history as we end out the show. On Friday, December 7th, was the 84th birthday of friend of the show, Noam Chomsky. Authority smashers Charnchy and Sean brought him a present. In 1842, in Russia, on Saturday the 9th, Peter Kropotkin, important geographer and anarchist communist, was born in Moscow. Now, of course, this is the prince who became a revolutionist, and he wrote the Encyclopedia Britannica anarchy definition in the famed 11th edition, and he's going to outlive Britannica. And he wrote, of course, quite a few books, but the best ones are Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution, and The Conquest of Bread. And there's a great collection of his writings at libcom.org. And also on this date in the U.S., IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, sponsored the first sit-down strike in the U.S. at a General Electric plant in Schenectady, New York. The method was adopted by labor movement in the 1930s, with the Flint sit-down strike being one of the most famous. And of course, on this date, the last birthday I wanted to get into was in 1865. August Spies was born, one of the Haymarket anarchists, labor agitator, and victim of anti-anarchist repression. I'd like to thank everybody for listening in, and I'm going to play us out.